Yes, we are recording. Hi, Sally.
Hello, hello.
So with any luck, Sally and I are going to record a quick video for you chatting about a recent paper that Sally's had published, looking at the prevalence of mental health difficulties amongst students compared to their non-student peers. We're hoping you will be very kind to us. Sally and I are testing out what it's like to record via Microsoft Teams. So wish us luck here. Sally, thanks for your time and patience with this. I was wondering if you could get us started by just telling us a little bit about the paper and summarise your key findings.
Yeah, so it's a very brief paper. It's a descriptive paper, so it's not really about the underlying processes or trends or reasons why. It's just trying to understand what the temporal trends over time might be in prevalence of self-harm and of common mental disorders, both in students and in non-students, so being able to compare the two. It makes use of a series of mental health surveys that were carried out in 2000, 2007 and 2014. And those surveys are really useful because they use very detailed, validated measures, and because they have used those same measures over time, so consistently, and because they use a random sample of the whole population. So it's a really high quality sample. A lot of surveys use convenient samples or volunteers. So this is a useful resource for us in public health because it covers the whole population. Now, some of the questions were whether or not someone was a student or not. So it enables us to compare students and non-students. And there were kind of two broad patterns that came out. One was that very broadly, in both students and non-students, and actually across all age ranges, we're seeing an increase in self-harming behaviour. So this is something which seems to be happening across the board. In terms of patterns of anxiety and depression, we actually see quite a lot of stability, both in students and non-students over time. But what we did find, and this was quite a tentative finding more recently, but it did emerge quite strongly, was an increase in anxiety and depression reported specifically amongst female students. So we weren't seeing that in non-students, and we weren't seeing that in male students. So that kind of those are the kind of the key findings from the paper.
Okay, that's really interesting, Sally. And I'm aware you've already given me a warning that you'd like to talk about the methods rather than the why. So we'll find someone else to have a think about why we're seeing that difference. But it's really interesting then that you're seeing that difference in self-harm and in female students. But are you seeing a gender difference in self-harm behaviour?
Well, we do see gender differences in self-harm behaviour in that the prevalence tends to be higher in women than in men. But in terms of the change over time, we've seen an increase happening both in women and men. It's just that the absolute level is higher in women than in men. So that's something which service providers, people in contact with students need to be aware that the prevalence will be quite high in both female students and non-students. Yeah.
Interesting. And Sally, can I take you back to the methods? You as you were summarising the paper for us, you kindly pointed out that sampling is really important. And I wonder for those of us that don't do lots of large data studies, sampling is important, and what you've got in this data set that you might not have in other data sets.
Yeah, so the sampling is key. And it was both a strength and a weakness of this paper. So major limitations of this paper around sampling were that we had a small sample of students, that we included 16 and 17-year-olds. So quite often people might be looking at these results and thinking that they all apply to the higher education population, but actually they're a bit broader than that. And they're also narrower in that we weren't able to, we undersampled certain groups of students. For example, those living in halls of residence, for example, tend not to be captured very well on household population surveys. However, on the other side, the benefits of using a sample like this is that we go out door to door and we recruit people who might not be otherwise reached by surveys. So It's not volunteers, it's not people who have responded to social media or other sorts of, who tend to pull in people who are interested and engaged or who feel a certain salience with the subject matter. This will include people who perhaps don't see themselves as having mental health problems, who don't self-harm, who so it's a much broader, more representative sample of the population. What we do is we sample addresses, all the addresses that the postcode will deliver, that the post office will deliver letters to. Mm-hmm. Then we go to the household and we randomly select one individual living in that household. So that's why it is important from, if we want to look at prevalence, to include people who might not want to, for whom the subject matter is not so relevant.
Okay. And how confident are you then in the data that you've analysed here that you're getting a real picture of what the prevalence is likely to be? How confident can we feel?
So it's probably quite a good reflection of the prevalence. But what we should flag up is, because of the relatively small sample size, the confidence interval around our estimates are wide. So we can be confident about that range, but that range is quite broad. So the accuracy of our figures, the precision of our figures might be weak, which is why it's really key that people replicate this approach using other data sources. So we have some other data sources that would be really suitable for someone to use for this sort of analysis. For example, the Health Survey for England has much larger sample, is carried out every single year, has been running since the early 1990s, and has got better questions identifying the students in that sample. Now, the measures of mental health it uses are not quite so detailed or specific or robust as what we use on this mental health survey, but it does include the GHQ-12, which is a really nice measure, general measure of psychiatric distress. So if someone wanted to, they could take all of those surveys over time and look at trends in students and non-students over time with a much larger sample than we used in this particular analysis.
Okay. And I was going to ask you, Sally, what you think the next steps are for research, but I presume that this is what you think we should be doing.
Well, I think it's key that more surveys identify students. So currently, a lot of these major general population surveys don't identify students in a very good way. So firstly, I think general population surveys all need to be asking about student status so that we can be looking at students and non-students and profiling students more clearly across the board. Another thing is that I think it's really key that studies of students, as well as other studies, are using assessments of mental health rather than just asking about whether or not people feel depressed or feel anxious, because perceptions of feeling depressed or feeling anxious can change over time. But if you're asking about very specific symptoms, then we can look in a more consistent way, which isn't so much affected by people's perceptions of their own mental health. So that I would recommend. And then the other thing I think will be really key will be collecting new data that understands the current situation that we're in now, because obviously the situation we're in now in terms of COVID, pandemic, the measures, the closing of lessons and face-to-face contact in universities will clearly be having a major impact on student mental health. And we won't be picking up on that in the face-to-face surveys because, of course, fieldwork on those have all been suspended.
Okay. Sally, finally, I'm just wondering, given the limitations that you've discussed and that we need to be aware of from your paper, are there still any recommendations that you'd give the higher education sector on the basis of your findings?
I think the key thing is this awareness of an increase across the board in self-harming behaviour. So how we respond to that and an awareness of that and a recognition of that. So it's something about coping styles and ensuring that we support the development of coping styles which are perhaps healthier for people in the longer term.
Okay. Sally, thank you ever so much for your time. This has been very interesting. We will share links for the paper if people want to read it and have a little bit more of a think of the ideas that Sally's been discussing here.
Thank you.